night lies over the Judean hills, and the city on the ridge holds its breath. Jerusalem sits high between valleys, the Kidron to the east beneath the Temple Mount, the Tiropuyan splitting the heights, the Hinnom curving to the south. Its walls run along broken limestone and stepped streets. Its heart is the temple platform, a vast paved rectangle, rebuilt under Herod a century earlier, white stone that catches first light like water. Priests keep the rhythm of sacrifices there. Pilgrims know the climbs by memory. And beyond the walls, Rome's roads touch every border. The story of the city's fall does not begin with fire. It begins with pressure accumulated across decades. In 63 BCE, Pompey, the Great entered Jerusalem after a civil war between Hasmonean claimants, marking the start of Roman dominion. Herod the Great reigned as Rome's client king from 37 to 4 BCE, raising palaces and fortresses and the enlarged temple complex that still dominated the skyline in 70 CE. After Herod's death, his realm fractured. By 6 CE, Judea became a Roman province under prefects and later procurators, its taxes and justice answerable to a governor at Caesarea and a legate in Syria. The province was small, but it combined sacred obligations with imperial expectations, an unstable chemistry. The points of abrasion were clear. Roman coinage and census-taking pressed against laws of purity and ancestral land. Imperial standards and shields offended where images were forbidden. The temple's daily sacrifice for the emperor symbolized obedience many accepted and others endured. In 40 CE, the Emperor Caligula's plan to set his statue in the sanctuary nearly ignited revolt before his death canceled the order. Under successive governors, grievances accumulated. Seizures of temple funds, extortion, heavy-handed policing. The office of high priest, once life-term and hereditary, was now granted and withdrawn by Roman authority, and the political temperature rose when holders lost legitimacy in popular eyes. In the summer of 66 CE, sparks found tinder. In Caesarea, Greeks sacrificed birds outside a synagogue. The local authorities did nothing. In Jerusalem, the procurator Gessius Florus marched into the city and, amid protests, seized 17 talents from the temple treasury, claiming imperial need. Demonstrations followed. Florus ordered troops to cut them down. Blood on the stones turned outrage to uprising. That same season, temple officials halted the daily sacrifice offered on behalf of the emperor, a decisive public break. Rebels overran the Antonia fortress abutting the temple platform, and the Roman garrison withdrew to Herod's palace on the western hill before being compelled to surrender. Many were killed after capitulation. The die was cast. Rome's first answer came quickly. Cestius Gallus, legate of Syria, marched south with Legio Duodecim Fulminata and auxiliaries, beat a path through coastal towns, and reached Jerusalem after the autumn feasts. He probed the northern walls and then, inexplicably, withdrew. On the climb back toward the pass at Beth Horon, Jewish forces harried his column. The retreat became a rout. 12 fulminata lost its eagle and heavy equipment, an imperial humiliation. In Jerusalem, mints struck silver shekels stamped Year 1 of the Redemption of Zion. Confidence surged. The war broadened. Rome's second answer was overwhelming. In early 67 CE, Nero appointed the veteran general Vespasian to crush the revolt. With Legio V Macedonica and Legio X Fretensis, joined by his son Titus with Legio XV Apollinaris, he advanced methodically from Galilee southward. Towns that resisted, Jotapata, Taricheae, Gamla, fell after sieges. Thousands died or were enslaved. At Jotapata, the rebel commander Joseph ben Matityahu was captured. He would live to write, as Flavius Josephus, the most detailed account of the war. By 68 CE, Perea and the coastal plain were subdued. The Jordan Valley lay open. Then Rome itself convulsed. The year of the 4 emperors toppled Nero and his successors in rapid succession. Vespasian paused operations, secured allegiance of eastern legions, and in December 69, CE was proclaimed emperor. He delegated the final campaign to Titus. Jerusalem awaited that campaign divided against itself. Refugees from the countryside had swollen the population. Grain had been stored for a long defense, but armed factions fought for control within the walls. John of Gischala, who had escaped Galilee, held the temple precincts with a large following. Simon Bar Giora commanded the upper city and parts of the lower, ruling through force. Eleazar ben Simon controlled inner courts until he was attacked during the Passover of 70 CE. In their struggle, granaries were burned, a decision Josephus condemns as fatal when famine later came. 3 concentric fortifications guarded the northern approaches. An outer wall begun by Agrippa II, a second wall encircling the northern lower city, and the oldest first wall protecting the upper city and the temple ridge. South and east, valleys and steep beds of rock gave natural defense. The city could hold if it could act as one. In the spring of 70 CE, Titus advanced. Legio V Macedonica and Legio XV. Apollinaris marched from Caesarea along the coastal road and turned inland. Legio X Fretensis came up from Jericho. Detachments of auxiliaries, archers, slingers, cavalry, and engineers joined them. According to Josephus, Titus established camps on the northern heights, opposite the second wall, and on the Mount of Olives east of the temple, placing Ex Fretensis there to watch the eastern approaches. Siege lines took shape. Scouts measured ground. Engineers marked platforms for artillery. The cohorts raised palisades and trenches in the Roman way, by routine, fast, silent. Inside the walls, the factions struck each other even as the legions deployed. During the Passover crowds, fighters loyal to John and Eleazar brawled within the temple courts. Blood fell in sacred space. Simon's men pressed their own enemies from the upper city. In the pause before the machines spoke, ordinary families barred doors and rationed grain they dared not show. Priests kept the order of offerings as long as animals could be found. From the northern ramparts, watchers could make out the regular geometry of Roman camps, the straight streets, the headquarters tent, the standards gathered like a small forest of eagles where orders were read at dusk. The first Roman move followed established doctrine: reduce the outer defenses and open space for machines. Heavy ballistae lobbed stones to clear parapets. Scorpiones sent iron bolts to drive men from battlements. Under cover of artillery, working parties dragged up timber and earth to raise siege ramps against the second wall. The defenders countered with sorties. Sudden gates flung open, runners with fire pots, archers shooting from flanks, sappers undermining ramps from the base. For days the two geometries, Roman order and the city's rugged ground, tested each other. Titus probed the defenses and, according to his own propaganda and Josephus's account, offered terms. Surrender the city and sanctuary. Accept Roman law. Spare the population from the siege's customary ending. From the walls, the answer came in missiles and taunts. To yield the temple was unthinkable. To trust Rome, for many, impossible. The legions closed in. When rams with iron heads, Nico and its kin, rolled up to the northern stones, men on the parapets threw down burning pitch and sacks of chaff. They dropped great beams chained together. They shot at the crews and the oxen that strained at the ropes. Rams swung in steady time, and the stones began to talk back. By May 70 CE, the second wall was breached. In fierce counterattacks, defenders briefly drove the Romans out, then lost the gap again. The cohort files poured through, seized ground inside, and tore down long stretches of the captured barrier to prevent its reuse. The fight pushed toward the first wall at the edge of the upper city, and toward the Antonia fortress that overlooked the temple. Titus shifted weight, moving men to the northeast corner, where capture of Antonia would expose the temple courts. In early June, with engines battered and countermines foiling saps, Titus changed approach. He ordered a circumvallation, an encircling wall of stakes and earth, to cut the city off entirely. Thousands of men built it in 3 days, nearly 5 Roman miles long, studded with towers, tying ridge to ridge, valley to valley. Nothing now left or entered without Roman leave. Famine sharpened. The value of a measure of grain rose beyond coin. Bands searched houses. Those suspected of hoarding were beaten. Graves multiplied in courtyards. Bodies were carried through alleys in the dark. The city that had once received festivals by the tens of thousands could not feed itself behind sealed gates. This is the line at which the siege becomes inevitable. The legions are in position on the north and east. The encircling wall is closed. The second wall is down. The first wall faces rams. The Antonia looms over the temple like a problem waiting for its solution. Inside, rivalry and hunger erode resolve. Outside, routine and iron press forward. The next movements, assault on Antonia, the struggle in the courts, the day the inner house burned, will follow from these facts set in place. At first light, the ring tightened. The encircling wall, 39 stadia by Josephus' measure, studded with towers, closed every path from ridge to valley. Timber and earth ran from the northern heights across the scarp toward Scopus, then swung eastward to face the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives, before returning along the southern ridges. Nothing living now entered or left without Roman consent. The circumvallation did more than starve. It ended the hope that sudden foraging or an allied relief could alter the arithmetic. Inside, factional wounds widened as hunger deepened. John of Gischala held the temple precincts and portions of the lower city. Simon Bar Giora commanded much of the upper city and the old palace quarter. Patrols loyal to one or the other seized stores, searched houses, and fought skirmishes in alleys whose stones remembered processions, not barricades. Bread, once a ritual abundance in feast seasons, became weight measured by seeds. Josephus writes that the granaries burned earlier in the civil strife would have prolonged resistance. Now, with the encircling wall complete, that loss turned from mistake to sentence. Titus moved the siege machines. On the north, he massed rams and towers against the first wall and the Antonia. The old Hasmonean stronghold strengthened by Herod, whose lofty platform surveyed the northwestern corner of the temple courts. Ballistae cleared parapets with stones the size of mill wheels. Torsion engines sent iron bolts that drove men from crenellations. Under leather screens and wicker mantlets, engineer cohorts pushed forward rams with iron heads that struck in the same measured rhythm as a legion's step. The defenders answered with local knowledge and sudden speed. Gates burst open for sorties. Men ran with firepots and pitch, flung burning sacks into the timber of siege ramps, and pulled back before cavalry could cut them off. Sappers tunneled beneath the feet of Roman towers to sap the ground. Where the earth fell in, they set fires in the timbers and withdrew into the smoke. Archers in the angles between walls shot down at flanks the engines could not shield. For days, the frontier between order and rock moved by paces, then slid back again. At the northeastern angle, Titus probed for a lever. The Antonia dominated the approach to the sacred courts. Take the fortress, and the broad pavement of the outer court lay open. Ramps went up toward its northern face, fed by timber dragged from the olive groves and stone quarried on the spot. The defenders countermined, lit the supports beneath the ramp, and withdrew. A section collapsed with a roar. Roman working parties began again. While the engines labored, persuasion was attempted. Josephus, now speaking for Titus, called up to the walls in his own tongue and in Greek, recounting Rome's strength, the miseries of famine, the sacrilege of factional bloodshed within the courts. He named a path that spared the sanctuary. stones and curses fell in reply. The daily sacrifice for the emperor had ceased in 66. In 70, the daily burnt offering itself halted. Josephus dates the last to the 17th of Tammuz, an absence that measured for many the end of order. The Romans closed for the Antonia again. Night assaults tested the stairways. Grapnels caught on parapets. Ladders rose and fell. According to Josephus, a cohort slipped in at night over a neglected height, killing the watch and opening a way for others to scale. When a foothold was secure, Titus ordered the captured sections of the Antonia dismantled to create a ramp from the north directly into the temple courts. Stones that had looked down on the sanctuary were turned into the road to it. Famine reached its hard middle. Prices unraveled beyond coin. Fathers traded heirlooms for a measure of flour. Mothers hid crusts from patrols sent by their supposed protectors. Josephus inserts into this portion of his narrative a single ghastly episode. A woman in the quarter beyond the valley, driven past the limits of custom by hunger, killing and eating her infant. He offers it as emblem of how scarcity unmade ordinary prohibitions. The account is his. Even summarized, it marks the moral cliff the city had reached. Capture meant spectacle and warning outside the walls. Those taken in sorties were crucified facing the city in such numbers, Josephus says, that space and timber failed. Others, who deserted carrying hidden coins, met a different danger among Rome's auxiliaries. Word ran through the camp that deserters swallowed gold to retrieve later. Men of the allied contingents cut open some to search. When the practice reached Titus's ears, he ordered it stopped and punished. But it had already darkened the ground outside the earthworks. Portents, reported by both Josephus and Tacitus, circulated like ash on wind, a sword-shaped star and a comet, a mysterious light within the temple at the feast of unleavened bread, the eastern gate opening of its own accord, voices saying, "Let us depart." The sources preserve them as things seen or said. The historian's caution notes they were recorded after the fact, their meanings arranged to match outcomes. Yet, they belong to the siege's weather. Anxiety, looking for pattern. By early July, the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, was a battlefield. Stones from the dismantled Antonia widened the Roman access. Shield walls advanced across the pavement under volleys of arrows and sling stones. Defenders fell back toward the inner balustrade that marked the boundary. Non-Jews could not legally cross. They had ringed the courts with makeshift palisades, pulled down cloisters to deny cover, and posted men along the steps and colonnades. Titus convened a council on the question of the sanctuary. Josephus's account portrays the general as wishing to preserve the temple as a monument to his victory and to Rome's clemency. Others in the council argued that as long as it stood, it would be a rallying point. The decision, as Josephus records it, seize the inner courts by force, restrain the fire if possible. Modern historians dispute motives, but on the ground, the order translated into renewed pressure on the inner enclosures from the north and west. Assault parties drove to the balustrade. Defenders yielded and counterattacked amid the columns, the sacred pavement greased with the oil of the lamps burned nightly for years. Cloisters along the northern and western edges caught fire during the fighting, whether from Roman torches thrown in disorder or from defenders' attempts to burn Roman works is debated. Josephus attributes the first great blaze to the defenders. Flames ran along cedar beams. Smoke lay low beneath the colonnades and then climbed. On the Mount of Olives, Legio ex Fretensis kept up a constant, harassing fire from engines planted on platforms facing the eastern wall. Arrows and stones arced across the Kidron. Men who tried to extinguish the fires in the outer colonnades did so under missiles falling in steady time. At the northern breach, rams worked at the gates leading to the court of Israel. The sound was continuous, iron on wood, wood on stone. The measured shout of legionaries raising the strike, the answering roar from the walls. Within the city, Simon and John still contested authority, even as the courts burned. Men under Simon held positions in the upper city and along the western defenses. John's men occupied the inner courts and the lower market. When Titus's forces pressed into the outer court, John and his fighters fell back toward the Nicanor Gate and the sanctuary buildings themselves, while Simon absorbed remnants into the upper city's stonework, preparing for a last resistance if the Temple Ridge fell. The calendar turned to the weeks Rome counted by consuls and the city by months of Tammuz and Av. Grain was gone. Water came from cisterns under lock and threat. Corpses were moved at night to house courtyards, then to trenches hastily cut when gates could not be opened. Families huddled in storerooms cut into the bedrock beneath houses. Priestly families clung to the inner chambers as long as the daily offerings could be kept in semblance. The last lambs were found and failed. The altar was washed and could not be fed. By late July, the Antonia was leveled down to an approach ramp. Roman standards looked across the open space to the sanctuary precincts. Fire smoldered in the northern cloisters and broke out again with each gust. Titus posted cohorts to hold the captured pavement and pushed forward rams against the inner gates. The defenders, shrinking in number, fought from the steps and lintels. A breach once widened would pour legionaries into the court of Israel and bring the battle to the sanctuary's very thresholds. That line now stood ahead, as plain as the outlines of the mount against the morning. Behind, the northern walls were down, the second wall gone, the first wall pressed. The circumvallation still cut every desire from its answer. Before, cloisters smoldered, gates shuddered. The balustrade trembled under feet that had counted prayer steps for a generation. The decision point, whether the inner house would be taken intact or lost to the same fire that ate the colonnades, lay within days. At dawn, the noise changed timbre. The rams no longer beat at outer masonry. Their rhythm moved deeper, swinging at the inner gates that faced the court of Israel. Smoke curled from the charred northern cloisters, blown low across the pavement, then lifted to reveal lines of shields advancing in measured steps from the dismantled Antonia. To the east, on the Mount of Olives, the platforms of Legio ex Praetensis threw stones and darts in a steady arc over the Kidron, harrying anyone who showed on the eastern colonnade. The circumvallation remained unbroken, its towers blinking signals, its ditch clean and dry, so that every breath taken inside the city came from what the city itself still held. Titus pressed the approach by method and trial. Working parties extended ramps toward the inner gates, binding rubble with timber, covering crews beneath leather screens darkened with soot and wetted against fire. Ballistae cleared parapets. Scorpiones snapped iron into the silhouettes of defenders. Archers pushed any exposed line away from the gate lintels. From within, men fought the fires with jars of water hauled from cisterns and with earth scooped from the paving joints. They toppled makeshift palisades to deny Roman ladders purchase. They swung down beams chained together into the mouths of the rams. When the engines struck, the gate leaves groaned like living things. In these days, the temple courts became a field of precise, terrible geometry. The outer pavement, Herod's broad court of the Gentiles, was already a scar of collapsed porticos. The balustrade's warning slabs still stood in places, their bilingual inscriptions half hidden under debris. Beyond it, steps rose toward the Nicanor gate and the inner enclosures. Titus, according to Josephus, convened his council there on the captured pavement to decide the sanctuary's fate. Some urged that the inner house be preserved as a trophy and proof of Roman clemency. Others argued that, so long as it stood, the building would be a rallying pole for resistance. The order that followed in practice was narrow and difficult. To seize the inner courts by force, while restraining the fire that had already found the northern cloisters. Assault parties went again, shields roofed, standards set back, rams swinging. The defenders yielded steps, then counterattacked in tight surges, using the angles of the colonnades to strike flanks and fall away. The oil kept for lamps made the paving treacherous. A gust drove smoke across the northern side. Under that low cover, a handful of legionaries reached the gate passage and levered a torch into a doorway. Flame took cedar, then air, then lintel. Josephus records the moment as an accident from an overzealous soldier. He also shows Titus running with shouted orders to extinguish what had begun. Whether command failed or fire refused correction, the fact is constant across sources. Flame entered the precinct that day and did not leave it. The inner house was sheathed in gold over cedar. Heat made a skin. Then the skin fed what lay beneath. Fire ran the lines of beams like a hand reading script. Smoke climbed through the open doors and into the courts. Embers fell like dry rain on the steps. The sound within turned from the crack of single timbers to a sustained rushing roar. Cohorts that had been battering the gates found themselves pulled forward by their own momentum into a blaze they could neither command nor wholly avoid. Titus stood at the threshold, according to Josephus, calling men off. The press of those already inside carried the work past recall. Standards were brought up when the sanctuary fell. eagles set by the eastern gate, sacrificial offerings made in front of them on the flagstones. The inner courts, where silence had once been part of the worship, filled with armor and the chant of legionary vows. Cloisters along the west and south caught in turn. Roofs went in sheets. Columns cracked under heat and toppled into the burning colonnades. Evening lit the smoke from beneath, turning it red and then black. By night, the great platform was a bowl of coals. Even in that hour, the fighting had corners. John's men, driven from the inner courts, fell back into the southern buildings and toward the lower city. Simon's lines hardened along the upper city's edges and the old palace quarter. The Antonian approaches, now a slope of broken stones, filled with firelight, as cohorts rotated off of the captured platform, and others went up to hold the ground against sorties. The Mount of Olives batteries kept up their harassment to prevent any gathering on the eastern wall. The circumvallation towers signaled the fall of the sanctuary along their line. Camp streets rang with horn calls answering one another in the dark. Morning showed the scale. The burn had cleared the crest of the Temple Mount. Ash lay over paving and steps. Fittings that had known polish were fused into runnels at the bases of stones. Among the debris, Roman details pried open storerooms and inner chambers. From those rooms the legions took the sacred objects that would later appear in triumph at Rome. The 7-branched lampstand, the table, trumpets, and vessels. Josephus describes Titus ordering a careful removal of what could be preserved as trophies once the combat along the platform ended. Elsewhere on the ridge, a gold vine of extraordinary workmanship was cut from its place. The inner building itself had ceased to be anything but heat and falling light. Outside the mount, the siege shifted its center of gravity. With the Temple Ridge consumed, the upper city, Western Hill, Palace Quarter, council houses, the Herodian towers, became the last fortress. Titus redeployed engines and labor to new ramps against the first wall's remaining heights. 4 main siege banks went up, 2 toward the palace district, 2 facing the upper city near the Cistus. Timber came from further afield now. The groves nearest had been stripped months before, and working parties dragged beams in from ridges past Scopus, binding the fill with stones pulled from ruined porticos. Within the shrinking city, discipline thinned under hunger and smoke. Simon and John, their strongholds divided by debris and Roman lines, still struck at one another's parties when the chance appeared and punished suspected hoarding with sudden searches. Grain had long gone, olives and pulse followed. Water was rationed from cisterns that had served festivals. The dead were moved at night when they could be moved. Trenches opened where they could not be carried out. The liturgy of the day, the order of offerings, had ended weeks earlier. Prayers became shorter and more private, murmured in rooms built into bedrock. Titus put spectacle to use as the ramps rose. Prisoners captured in sallies were fixed on crosses facing the walls in such numbers that, Josephus says, space and timber failed. Others, attempting to sneak out at night with coins sewn into belts or hidden under cloaks, took their chances against the cordon. Some were caught by auxiliaries whose officers could not keep pace with the practice of cutting open hussies to hunt for swallowed gold. When the abuse reached Titus, punishments followed, late, and not in time to undo what had been done along the embankments. Tacitus, writing from Rome with the distance of a senator and a skeptic, added portents to the chronology. Visions of armed hosts in the sky, the eastern gate opening of its own accord, a voice heard within the sanctuary at festival, saying, "Let us depart." He treats them as signs interpreted after the fact. Josephus presents them as warnings unheeded. Both agree on the month when the inner house burned. In Judean reckoning, Av. Josephus names the 10th. Later tradition marks the 9th, corresponding by modern calculation to early August of 70 CE. The exact day varies by source. The sequence is not in dispute. From the ruins of the Antonia down into the city, Roman detachments made the captured crest a base of motion. Cohorts moved along the Tyropoeon's upper rim to cut connections between lower and upper city. Others turned the southern arc of the temple platform into a station from which to pound the offal and the steps that climbed toward the old palace. In the lower city, fires set during the fighting ran unchecked through markets and workshops. Those who tried to flee toward the north found the new embankments there. Those who tried the south met the gorge of Hinnom, mashed with the debris, and staked where it could be crossed. At the palace, the great towers, Hippicus, Phasael, Mariam, still stood, massive and square, the best stone Herod's masons had ever laid. Titus chose to keep them intact, first as a demonstration to negotiators of how little remained defensible, later as testimony to the difficulty of the ground once the city had fallen. The first pushes against the upper city failed to carry their objectives. Titus shifted more weight to the western banks, built higher, and ordered continuous fire from engines placed to rake the heights. Between assaults, the Roman commander sent Josephus once more to speak beneath the wall, promise of life if surrender came promptly, warning that further delay would set flames through the last district. From above, a few called down that they would yield. Most shouted back defiance. To those who did climb down ropes by night and risk the cordon, Titus gave marks to spare them from the worst of the guards and assigned them to the camp with rations. The stream was small and did not change the arithmetic. As August waned, the banks reached their lips. Rams swung against gates that had survived years and now hours. The iron heads bit. Lintels moved. At breaches widened by picks and fire, cohorts went through under the curve of shield rims, standard bearers at their shoulders. The fighting in the upper city's first streets was house to house, door to door, stair to roof. Stones built into the hill slowed every rush. Where resistance was thickest, torches went into lintels and inner rooms. Where it thinned, sentry blocks flowed past in files to stamp authority along the hill's spine. In this phase, the city that had been a place of processions, the long upwalks to festivals, the turning of crowds at the gates, became an obstacle course of collapsed walls and blind corners. Engineers came behind the first lines with picks and levers, widening the lanes so that units could hand off position without losing cohesion. Behind them, details pulled down what still stood in order to deny shelter to any further stand. The air filled with a constant powder of lime. The heat carried a forest smell from wood that had seasoned for decades. By month's end, the Temple Ridge was a blackened platform patrolled by files of legionaries. The lower city had burned in streaks and blocks. The upper city's edges were peeling back under rams and fire. The 3 Herodian towers still rose like square cliffs. Beyond them, the palace courts made a last geometry of open ground and porticoed edges. Simon and John, cut from one another by the Roman wedge from the north and the fire line from the south, commanded pockets rather than a city. The siege had narrowed to its final rectangle. Behind the Roman lines, the camps remained orderly. Graveled streets, headquarters tents with standards planted, the measuring of rations, the changing of watches. Along the circumvallation, the towers still took turns flashing the news at dusk. And from the Mount of Olives, the engines faced eastward, no longer in hope of denying rescues, but as habit. Stones lobbed in a cadence that had become part of the day's weather. The decision that remained lay under the towers at the palace and along the last stretch of the first wall. Whether a surrender would be accepted in time to spare the western hill, or whether fire would complete the work that had begun on the sanctuary's ridge. The chapter's line now ran straight. The inner house burned in early August. Standards were set at the eastern gate. Trophies were taken from inner rooms. The fight shifted west. New banks rose. The upper city came under ram and flame. The next movement, breach, fall of the palace quarter, capture of leaders, and the formal end of the siege, waited at the lip of those ramps, under stones that had watched 10,000 mornings. By late August, the legions shifted their weight decisively west. With the Temple Ridge burned to a black platform, and the Antonia leveled into an approach, Titus concentrated men and engines against the upper city, the palace quarter, council houses, and the dense neighborhoods on the western hill. 4 new siege banks went up, 2 facing the Herodian palace and its 3 great towers, Hippicus, Phasael, Mariam. 2 pitched toward the upper city near the Xistus. Timber came from farther ridges. Nearer groves had long since been stripped. Cohorts hauled beams, bound the fill with rubble, pulled from collapsed porticos, and roofed working parties under leather screens darkened against fire. The rams found new rhythm on this ground. Ballistae cleared parapets. Scorpiones snapped iron bolts into the angles of towers. Archers pressed defenders back from gate lintels. From within, men loyal to Simon Bar-Giora and John of Gishala fought in pockets rather than a single line. The city's internal front never entirely closed. Where opportunity appeared, Simon's and John's followers still struck one another, even as Roman engines advanced. Famine reached a level at which common rules broke. Search parties combed houses for grain. Cisterns were rationed. The dead were moved at night or buried in trenches cut into courts when gates could not be opened. Earlier in the war, granaries had been burned during factional fighting. With Titus's circumvallation now complete, that mistake had become decisive. Titus paired pressure with offer. Josephus records several calls to surrender, promises of life if arms were dropped and the high places yielded. From the walls and from the last strong points, most answers were refusals. A few risked a rope at night and took their chances with the cordon. Those who made it were marked to spare them the worst hands along the Roman lines. Their trickle did not change the arithmetic. Once the western banks reached their lips, the assault moved in series. Rams beat at gates and seams. Picks probed courses loosened by weeks of shock. When a section slumped, sentry blocks pushed over the fragments under the curve of shield rims. Fighting on the western hill was house to house, stair to roof, and down again into basements cut from limestone. Where resistance was thickest, torches went into lintels and inner rooms. Where it thinned, engineers followed to widen lanes so fresh files could hand off position without losing cohesion. Lime dust hung in the heat. The air carried the resin smell of beams that had seasoned for decades. The Herodian towers dominated the skyline. Massive, square, laid from the best ashlar of the dynasty, whose stamp still marked the city's stone. Titus chose to keep them. In the running fight toward the palace, he ordered the towers spared, first to show negotiators how little else remained defensible, later as testimony to the strength of the fortification once the city had fallen. Elsewhere, demolition advanced as policy. Josephus notes that after capture, Titus ordered Jerusalem's walls thrown down, leaving the three towers and a short stretch of western curtain to demonstrate Rome's victory and the difficulty of the ground. The last organized resistance concentrated around the palace courts and a few nodes along the first wall. Simon's men anchored on the western ridge. Remnants under John clung to pockets south of the burned temple platform. Roman files drove wedges between these positions, one along the Tyropoeon's upper rim, one sweeping the southern edge of the platform, one pushing from the north through collapsed neighborhoods. Where a stand formed in a street, it was taken from roof lines and from doorways at the same time. Where a stand fixed to a building, engineers pulled it down from the rear to deny its use a second time. Josephus' figures for losses and captives in these final days are stark and debated. He writes that 1.1 million perished in the siege and fighting, many of them pilgrims trapped by the Passover crowds when Titus's lines closed, and that 97,000 were taken alive. The old and infirm were killed when found. The young and able were sold, sent to provincial mines, or consigned to amphitheaters for shows at Caesarea and Berytus. The numbers are those of an eyewitness with a purpose. Modern estimates are lower. The shape of the outcome is not in dispute. Large-scale death by famine and sword, enslavement on a vast scale, and the violent hollowing of the city's population. Roman practice added warning to victory. During the last pushes, prisoners taken in sallies were crucified facing the walls in such numbers that Josephus says, space and timber failed. A separate brutality touched deserters. Rumors spread that some swallowed gold to retrieve it later. Auxiliaries cut open bodies to search. Titus punished the practice when he learned of it, but the ground along the embankments was already stained. These episodes sit in all the principal narratives as part of the siege's weather. Examples of how war's routine turns once limits fall. The capture of leaders followed the city's fall in stages. John of Giscala, trapped in galleries beneath the burned ridge, surrendered and was kept alive to be shown in the triumph at Rome. He was later imprisoned for life. Simon Bar Giora hid in underground passages and cisterns. When the food and air ran out, he emerged through a shaft among the ruins in white garments, perhaps hoping to frighten or to signal appeal. He was seized, held for the triumph, and executed afterward in Rome. With their removal, organized resistance inside Jerusalem ceased. The moment of the upper city's taking is dated by Josephus to late in the summer of 70 CE. After the burning of the temple in the month of Av, the western hill fell in Elul, late August, early September, by modern reckoning. Standards were raised on the captured heights. Cohorts spread along the crest and down into the western streets. Fires set in the fighting ran unchecked where they found timber. Elsewhere, demolition finished the work. Titus left the 3 Herodian towers, standing along with a short span of western wall. Everything between was leveled to bedrock or to a rubble field. The spoils were gathered methodically. From inner rooms on the burned platform and from secure storerooms, Roman details removed sacred objects to be carried in triumph. The 7-branched lampstand, the table for the bread of the presence, silver trumpets, vessels. A great golden vine that had adorned the temple was cut down. These appear later in set pieces of Flavian propaganda. Vespasian and Titus's Judea Capta coinage, the triumph at Rome in 71 CE, and the Arch of Titus, raised a decade later under Domitian, whose reliefs still show soldiers bearing the menorah and table through a Roman crowd. Administration followed quickly. Titus stationed a garrison in and around the ruins. Legio X Fretensis took Jerusalem as a permanent base and camped amid the leveled temple area and on the western hill. The province's tax regime shifted under the Flavians. The fiscus Judaicus, Jewish tax, was imposed, diverting to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome the half-shekel that Jews had once paid to the Jerusalem temple. The message was both fiscal and political. Rome now held the sacred center and would be acknowledged for it in coin. Archaeology has traced the physical scars that the texts describe. Burn layers and smashed vessels mark late Second Temple strata in the city of David and along the western hill. Dozens of limestone ballista stones have been recovered near the first and second wall lines. One cache outside the northern sector sits where Roman engines likely stood. At the southwest corner of the Temple Mount, toppled ashlars crushed the paved street below. Among them, excavators found the trumpeting place inscription, thought to have fallen from the corner where a priest once announced the entry of the Sabbath. In the drainage channel running beneath the Tyropuyan Valley Street, the remains of people who hid during the final searches have been uncovered. Pottery, coins, and a few human bones in situ. Silent witnesses to the last days in the city. Policy toward the site itself was clear. Beyond the towers and the short western segment, Jerusalem was to remain a ruin, a sign of Roman power and a practical denial of quick refortification. Josephus writes that a visitor soon after would scarcely believe the place had been inhabited. In the months that followed, Roman units finished demolition, sorted spoils, and sent captives to coastal depots. Titus wintered in Caesarea and Berytus, staging games in which prisoners died in the arena. In 71 CE, he sailed to Rome for the triumph with Vespasian. The procession displayed the temple treasures and leaders of the revolt. The end of the line showed Simon's fate. The war, however, did not end entirely with Jerusalem's fall. Roman detachments still had work to do east and south. Herodium capitulated. Machaerus fell after negotiation. Masada, perched above the Dead Sea, would hold out into 73 or 74 CE under Eleazar ben Yair and the Sicarii. Legio X Fretensis took part in these operations while maintaining the garrison at the ruined capital. The Flavian settlement of Judea, military, fiscal, propagandistic, took shape in these years, and the memory of the city's destruction began to seed texts and rituals among survivors and exiles. Behind the names and figures, the map changed permanently. The temple service ended with the fire. Priestly families dispersed. Pharisaic teachers regrouped on the coast, and later at Yavne to rebuild communal law without a sacrificial center. The Western Hill, once a grid of streets and courtyards, lay under ash and thrown-down stone. The Eastern Platform, once polished smooth by festivals, cooled to a black scar patrolled by men whose standards bore eagles instead of trumpets. From Rome, the image of the menorah walking under arches taught a lesson meant to be remembered. By the close of 70 CE, the siege had a concluding shape recognized by every source that records it. Temple burned in Ava, upper city taken in the weeks after, walls thrown down, towers left as witness, leaders captured and paraded, population killed or enslaved, garrison installed, spoils and stories sent west. What remained for Rome and Judea were the outlying strongholds and the management of the new order. What remained for those who had called Jerusalem home was flight, captivity, or the work of making life under loss. The next movement of this history follows both lines. The last fortresses on desert cliffs, and the ways the fall of the city began to live on in law, coin, and memory. The city had fallen, but the war did not end with smoke lifting from the Temple Ridge. In the weeks after the upper city was taken, the legions worked by routine. Detachments pried stones from courses and pushed them over in files. Engineers widened lanes. Surveyors marked the few structures Titus would spare. The 3 Herodian towers and a short span of wall as witness. Legio X Fretensis settled in among the ruins, its streets laid out in the familiar grid, its standards rising where festival processions had once turned. The camp ovens smoked, the watch changed by trumpet. The ruined platform to the east cooled from red to gray under patrols that learned its edges. Rome made the victory public. In the spring of 71 CE, Vespasian and Titus returned to the capital for a joint triumph. Josephus describes the procession: spoils piled high on litters, golden vessels, engraved tables, the 7-branched lampstand, the silver trumpets, painted panels showing the siege lines, prisoners led on, and, at the end, leaders of the revolt. John of Gischala was spared for life imprisonment. Simon Bar Giora was executed at the Forum after the chariots passed. A decade later, under Domitian, the Arch of Titus fixed the scene in stone. Soldiers bearing the menorah through a Roman crowd, the legend Judea Capta, already familiar from Flavian coinage. In the provinces, the same message reached fingers and markets. Bronze and silver pieces struck with a mourning figure beneath a palm tree, the conquered land personified, and the empire's order affirmed. Policy followed spectacle. The temple tax owed by Jews the world over, the half-shekel once sent to Jerusalem, was redirected by imperial decree to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus at Rome, the Fiscus Judaicus. It was a fiscal measure and a political one, marking the shift of sacred center from the Mount to the capital. Administratively, Jerusalem remained a garrisoned ruin. Legio ex Fretensis made it a base. Units patrolled roads toward the coast and the Jordan. The provincial governor managed confiscations and the sale or transport of captives. Josephus's figures, over 1 million dead during the siege and 97,000 enslaved, are often read as polemical and likely high. They still preserve the scale of what followed: forced marches to coastal depots, sales in markets from Caesarea to Antioch, and labor gangs sent to quarries and mines. In Caesarea and Berytus, games staged for the victory included executions of prisoners in the amphitheater. The countryside, too, had to be reduced. In 71 to 72 CE, the Flavian commanders turned to the remaining fortified sites. Lucilius Bassus, appointed to succeed Titus in Judea, moved first against Herodium, the palace fortress that Herod had set on a cone of earth south of Jerusalem. Its circular casemate wall and towers still stood over storerooms and cisterns dug into the hill. After a brief siege, the garrison capitulated. From there, Bassus marched east to Machaerus on the Transjordan Plateau, a stronghold overlooking the Dead Sea. Josephus says a combination of siege works and negotiation brought its fall. Those capable of bearing arms were killed, the rest spared. With Bassus's death, Flavius Silva took command. The largest work remained: Masada. Masada rose almost 900 feet above the desert floor, a mesa isolated by sheer slopes. Herod had built a winter palace on its northern spur, terraces stepping down the cliff face. and ringed the summit with a casemate wall and towers. Inside lay storehouses, barracks, and vast cisterns fed by channels that caught winter floodwater from the wadis. After Jerusalem's fall, Sicarii under Eleazar ben Yair held the heights, joined by families and fighters who had fled the burning quarters. From Masada, they could look across the Dead Sea to Moab's purple line, and south to the salt pan and the mouths of dry canyons. Silva brought up Legio ex Fretensis and auxiliaries, then did what Roman armies did best: wrapped the objective. Around the mesa he threw a circumvallation wall roughly 4.5 to 5 kilometers long, punctuated by 8 compact camps whose square outlines still lie stark against the desert gravel. Where Jerusalem had required months of ramps, Masada demanded engineering at a different scale, a single viable approach across sheer stone. On the western side, where the slope is least steep, the legions and auxiliary construction units began to build a siege ramp. Layers of stones and earth carried up in baskets, bonded into a wedge that rose week by week toward the summit wall. Even today, the ramp stands as a blunt scar pressed against the cliff. The defenders answered with fire, and stones rolled from parapets, then with a wooden inner revetment faced by earth to dampen the blows of the ram they knew would come. Silva had a siege tower, and ram brought to the lip of the new ramp. The tower's upper platforms sheltered archers who drove men from the parapet. The ram's iron head swung in regular time against the stone curtain. Josephus writes that the first breach was foiled by that earthwork infill, absorbing the ram's blows. The Romans returned the next day with fire, igniting the timber inside. As the revetment smoldered and collapsed, a new breach opened. Josephus's narrative of what followed is the only ancient account. When the breach made assault inevitable, Eleazar ben Yair called the defenders to choose death rather than capture. Lots were drawn. Groups killed one another in order. The last man fell on his own blade. At dawn, Roman troops entered to find fires set and bodies in inner rooms. Josephus gives the number as 960, with 2 women and 5 children surviving, hidden in a cistern, to tell the story. Modern scholars argue the numbers, the mechanics, and the rhetorical shaping of Josephus's account. Archaeology neither proves nor disproves the manner of death, but confirms the siege. Yigael Yadin's excavations in the 1960s uncovered the circumvallation wall and camps, the western ramp, casemate rooms with storage jars and carbonized grain, Roman camp stamps mentioning the 10th Legion, and ostraca, inked potsherds, one bearing the name Ben Yair, likely a later marker but evocative. What remains in the ground is the Roman method, and the fact of an end on a high, isolated table of rock in 73/74 CE. With Masada reduced, the First Jewish War closed. Roman garrisons distributed along the Jordan and in coastal towns. Tax farmers went to work, and confiscated estates changed hands. In the ruined capital, the 10th Legion stayed on. Bricks stamped with its emblems turn up in later strata. Its presence fixed the site as a military zone. The temple tax's redirection persisted. The Judea capta coin types continued to circulate. In Rome, the Flavian building program, Colosseum, baths, arches, drew on war spoils and the labor of captives. Memory, too, began to harden. The relief on the arch of Titus, the historian Tacitus's compressed account for a senatorial audience, Josephus's sprawling narrative in Greek, written under Flavian patronage and framed as a warning about civil war. Within Judea's surviving communities, leadership shifted. The priesthood had lost its place with the temple. Sadducean authority had no sanctuary to stand on. Pharisaic teachers, who had long built law around study, courts, and daily practice, held meetings on the coast, then at Yavna, Jamnia. Later tradition, preserved in rabbinic literature, places Yohanan ben Zakkai there, and tells a story of his leaving the besieged city to petition Vespasian, a tale of foresight that may overlay a simpler reality of imperial license granted to a circle of scholars. What can be traced with more confidence is the move to make communal life portable. Calendar set by witnesses and court, prayer to stand where sacrifice had, legal study and debate replacing temple administration. From loss, a different kind of continuity was built. Travelers and refugees carried the fall outward. Communities in Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome absorbed people and stories. In synagogues far from Jerusalem, fast days fixed memory to the calendar. The 9th of Av marked as a day of mourning for the destruction. Readings and keynote, lamentations filled with images of siege and fire. Early Christian writers, reading the same events through a different lens, attached meanings of their own. The same stones told different stories. Back on the ridge, the ruin set conditions for the next century. The garrisoned site remained a military and administrative node. The eastern platform stayed empty of sacred use under Rome. Decades later, after a generation of simmering tensions and another great revolt under Hadrian, the site would be renamed and rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter on the mount. That lies ahead in the arc of this history. In the immediate aftermath of 70 to 74, the lines are simpler. The war closed with a triumph in Rome and a desert siege. Judea was pacified under the legions. The temple service ended. Law and worship migrated into houses, halls, and academies, and the city on the ridge became a ruin haunted by patrols and by those who remembered its streets. Archaeology walks the lines of these texts. In Jerusalem, on the southwestern corner of the mount, toppled ashlars lie where they fell onto the Herodian street, the trumpeting place inscription face down beside them. Ballista stones cluster north of the city's first and second walls. In the Tyropoeon's buried drainage, cooking pots and coins sit where hands left them at the end. Along the Dead Sea, the square Roman camps and the long scar of the Masada ramp draw hard lines against the pale gravel. The ground keeps score in a style that does not flatter anyone, and needs no speeches. By the mid-70s, the empire had what it wanted: a province stripped of its capital's defenses, a tax flowing to the capital, spoils paraded in the city that named and funded the war. Those who had called Jerusalem home faced three paths: captivity, exile, or the work of making life under loss. From those choices, the next chapters of this history take shape: how law and memory were rebuilt without a sanctuary, how Rome and its successors remade the ridge, and how the fall of the city came to live in prayers, coins, and arches far from the limestone where it began. In the years after the western hill went quiet, the outlines of rule hardened. Legio ex praetensis kept its order among streets pulled down to bedrock. Bricks, stamped with its emblem, marked ovens and bathhouses where festival smoke had once risen. Roman surveyors measured the ridge as a military zone. Patrols ranged the roads to the coast and the Jordan. The victory was public and portable. Coins struck Judaea capta traveled through markets from Hispania to Syria. The triumph in 71 CE fixed the menorah and trumpets in Rome's memory. The fiscus Judaicus redirected the half-shekel, once sent to the temple, toward Jupiter's hill. The ridge itself stayed a ruin by design. 3 Herodian towers left standing as a statement and a warning. Communal life bent, but did not break. With priestly service ended, authority shifted to teachers whose court and calendar could move. On the coast, and then at Yavna, Jamnia, Pharisaic sages rebuilt the framework of daily law and public prayer. A council fixed fasts and festivals by testimony and reckoning, adjusted liturgy to a world without sacrifice, debated civil cases, and taught students who would carry the method inland again. Names that later tradition remembers: Yohanan ben Zakkai, Rabban Gamaliel II, and the early Tanaim. Attach to this work of turning dispersed villages and synagogues into a network that could hold memory without the mount. The Flavian settlement did not end trouble. In 115 to 117 CE, while the 10th Legion held the ridge, rebellion flared far from Judea in Jewish communities of Cyrenaica, Egypt, and Cyprus, the Kitos War. Cassius Dio, our Roman source for these years, summarizes the violence starkly. Cities burned, populations uprooted, Roman generals sent with hard orders. Lucius Quietus and Marcius Turbo suppressed the uprisings. In Cyprus, Jews were afterward forbidden to land. The fighting brushed Syria and Judea only at the edges, but it sharpened imperial suspicion and set a pattern the next generation would remember. Hadrian succeeded Trajan in 117 CE with a quieter program: abandon distant conquests, fortify borders, regularize provinces. He visited the East, traveled the roads, and favored Greek civic life. In Judea, his policy combined tidiness with provocation. Sometime around 130 CE, he resolved to found a Roman colony on the ridge and to overwrite the ruin with a new name and plan: Aelia Capitolina. a grid of cardo and decumanus, forums and baths, with a temple to Jupiter on the former temple platform. Dio also notes an edict against circumcision, framed as a ban on mutilation. Each decision touched a nerve. Work began. Survey stakes set. Paving planned. Veterans assigned future plots. For communities that had fasted over the ridge and turned toward it in prayer, a colony and a Capitoline temple meant erasure in stone. The revolt that followed in 132 Cios and gathered under a leader whose letters call him Shimon ben Kosiba, and whose followers hailed him as Bar Kokhba, son of the star, an echo of an old oracle. The first months went Rome's way only on paper. Garrison posts fell. Roads became ambush corridors. The revolt established control over broad stretches of Judea's hill country. Coins were overstruck on Roman issues, their Latin legends hammered flat and replaced with Hebrew lines. Year 1 of the redemption of Israel. Year 2 of the freedom of Israel. Palm branch and lulav, lyre, and a facade that evoked the sanctuary. Administration appeared in the letters recovered from caves along the desert's edge. Orders for supplies, exemptions, lists of villages and their obligations, seals and receipts. The movement had a center of gravity around the southern highlands. Beitar, later remembered as its last stronghold, and ran by command rather than by riot. Rome answered by weight and by patience. Hadrian pulled Julius Severus from Britain, one of his best field commanders, and drew in legions from multiple provinces. Fretensis fought on its home ground. 6 Ferrata moved in from Syria. Detachments of 2 Traiana from Egypt and others filled the line. Operations avoided open battle, where the rebels were strongest, and instead pared away forts and villages, cut harvests, sealed caves, and tightened the circle. The fight was longer and costlier than the siege a generation earlier. Hadrian's post-war report to the Senate omitted the customary, "I and the army are well," a silence Roman writers noticed. Dio's figures give the scale he wanted his readers to grasp: 580,000 slain in fighting, many more by famine and disease, 50 fortified towns, and hundreds of villages destroyed. Numbers at this distance are rhetoric as well as record, but the direction is certain. Heavy losses on both sides, the landscape stripped, the revolt crushed methodically. The fall of Beitar in 135 CE became the emblematic end in later Jewish memory. Archaeological anchors for its exact location remain debated, but the war's last months tightened there, and along the ridgelines southwest of the ruined capital. The post-war settlement redrew the map and the vocabulary. The province of Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, likely to sever in administration and inscription the association of land and people that had underwritten previous rebellions. Aelia Capitolina moved from plan to stone. The Cardo ran north-south through the western hill, later extended under the Byzantines. The Decumanus crossed it. A forum took shape where streets met. Gates were raised at the city's edges. On the temple platform, a Capitoline precinct rose. Later sources remember an equestrian statue of Hadrian nearby. A legionary garrison remained, the old 10th, and in the north, 6th Ferrata, at a base whose name, Legio, near Megiddo, survived in the Arabic Lejun into modern times. Access to the ridge shifted from tradition to permit. Sources from late antiquity remember a ban on Jews entering Aelia Capitolina, relaxed on the fast of the 9th of Av to allow mourning at the temple site. The details and dates of enforcement are tangled in later retellings, but the thrust is consistent. The city was remade as a Roman colony and governed as such. The local church changed character as well. After 135, the line of bishops at Aelia was Gentile rather than Judean, as Eusebius of Caesarea records, and the community within the colony's walls adapted to Roman civic rhythms. In the countryside, the legal and intellectual center of Jewish life moved north. The Sanhedrin, however it is precisely reconstructed, sat at Usha in the Galilee in the aftermath, then at Shepharam, Sepphoris, and finally Tiberias over the next generations. Teachers remembered as the 10 martyrs, including Akiva, entered martyrologies tied to Hadrianic persecutions. Beneath the hagiography lies a simpler fact of crackdown. Usha decrees in later tradition tightened communal obligations. Study houses framed law for farms and workshops rather than a temple bureaucracy. By about 200 CE, Judah Hanasi, Judah the Prince, would codify the Mishnah in the north, outside our chapter's years, but on the path laid by the decades we are tracing. Archaeology fixes pieces of this second act to ground. Along the desert's cliffs, the Cave of Letters and nearby shelters at Nahal Hever and Nahal Murabaat yielded papyri, land deeds from the Babatha archive, military orders signed by Shimon ben Kosuba, Prince of Israel, supply lists, and correspondence that names village officers pressed for wheat, wine, and guards. The letters speak in a brisk administrative voice and turn a revolt into offices and deadlines. Coins of Bar Kokhba, overstruck denarii and tetradrachms, carry Paleo-Hebrew legends and images that joined piety and policy. In Aelia, Roman street grids and gates are recoverable in stone. The North Gate, under the later Damascus Gate, a triple-arched entrance near today's Ecce Homo on the Decumanus, the line of the main cardo under later pavements marked by column bases. Milestones and inscriptions mention the legions. Bathhouse bricks bear leg X stamps. Hadrianic coins name Coel Al Capitole N.A., with a Capitoline temple shown in tidy relief. Law on the ridge reflected the colony. Altars and statues marked civic spaces. Pagan dedications stood where Jewish fasts remembered the ruin. The annual tax to Jupiter's temple continued to run. if Rome's aim had been to prevent the ridge from becoming a rallying point again, the combination of renaming, refounding, and permanent military presence made the point in stone and in coin. Memory followed people. Fast days formalized earlier griefs. The 9th of Av gathered more than one loss. The burned temple of 586 BCE, the fire of 70 CE, and later calamities pressed into a single liturgy of lament. In the Galilee, teachers turned siege stories and parables into law and custom without the language of revolt. Communities across the Mediterranean, Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, folded refugees and returned soldiers into their economies and synagogues. The menorah on Titus's arch looked back at them when they visited the capital. Prayers in far towns pointed to a hill they could not enter. From Rome's side, the Flavian program matured into Hadrian's certainty. Boundaries held by roads and legions, provinces regularized by colonies, trouble met by weight and technique. Syria, Palestina, sat inside that system, patrolled along the Jordan and Galilee, crossed by milestones that counted the miles back to Antioch and to the settled sea. The 10th Legion's camp on the ridge gave the city a military grammar. The new colony gave it a civic one. Neither needed the old language of the Mount. What had begun in 70 as flame and shock settled by the 100s and 30s into a long after-image, administrative, legal, devotional. The ridge bore a Roman name, the province a wider one, the community that had kept sacrifice, kept calendar and study instead. The story of the fall became something told on fixed days in chant and law. Yet the ground continued to remember. On the southwestern corner of the temple platform, the toppled ashlars still lay where they had crushed the Herodian street decades earlier. In the drainage under the Tyropoeon, cooking pots and coins remained where hands left them during the last searches. Along the Dead Sea cliffs, the circumvallation of Masada still cut a line through pale gravel. In caves above the canyons, ink on papyrus had not yet turned to dust. Between stone and text, the shape of the aftermath held. A city remade, a province renamed, a people redistributed across a map, and a memory reorganized so it could outlast the loss that had forced it. The map that followed the Bar Kokhba revolt was administrative as well as physical. By the mid-100 to 3050s, the province, long called Judea, was listed in imperial records as Syria Palestina. The refounded city on the ridge bore a Roman civic name, Aelia Capitolina, laid out on a grid, a north-south cardo with colonnades and shops, an east-west decumanus, forum space where the axes met, baths, a theater or Odeon, and milestones that counted distances outward to Caesarea and Damascus. Legionary bricks stamped with LEGXFRET fixed the tent's presence in ovens and bathhouses. A dedicatory precinct to Jupiter rose on the temple platform, and an equestrian statue of Hadrian stood nearby by late antique accounts. The old topography The Temple Mount, the Western Hill, the valleys, remained, but the meanings were rewritten in Latin. Access matched policy. After 135, Jews were generally excluded from the colony, with late sources allowing an exception for the 9th of Av, so mourners could approach the mount to weep. Enforcement varied across decades, but the thrust is consistent. The Ridge was a Roman colony with a military grammar. The local church within Aelia became Gentile in leadership. Eusebius later listed bishops from that period. The countryside adjusted. Villages rebuilt terraces. Roads and way stations served legions and tax collection. Coastal ports absorbed trade, and people stripped out of the hill country. Authority within Jewish life shifted north and inward. Priestly service had ended in 70. The Bar Kokhba losses dispersed what remained of that leadership. In the Galilee and along the coast, teachers and courts consolidated a portable framework. A council active at Yavne before 100 CE reappears in later memory in Galilee, after 135. At Usha, then Shepharam and Sepphoris, finally Tiberias. There, figures remembered as Tanaim argued law for a world of farms, markets, and courts, rather than sacrifices and watchposts. By around 200 CE, Judah Hanasi completed the Mishnah, a compact Hebrew code that fixed disputes and allowed teaching to travel. Its organization, 6 orders covering agriculture, festivals, family law, civil damages, sacred matters, and purity, mapped everyday life without a temple. Over the next centuries in Galilee, discussions on the Mishnah by Amoraim were gathered into the Talmud Yerushalmi, Jerusalem Talmud, compiled in its final forms by the 4th to 5th centuries, around Tiberias and Caesarea. Despite its name, archaeology follows this move. Synagogues in Galilee and the Golan, at places like Hamat, Tiberias, and Sepphoris, show 4th century floors of mosaic with both biblical scenes and zodiac circles around a sun chariot, inscriptions naming donors, and Aramaic and Greek texts. The art marks a Judaism working inside Roman Byzantine visual language, while keeping Hebrew and Aramaic liturgy. Rural sites yield stamped jar handles and oil presses. Urban layers in Sepphoris and Tiberias show colonnaded streets and workshops tied to regional trade. The evidence matches texts, a shift of scholarly and communal center from the ridge to the north. Imperial administration also changed in the 4th century. Diocletian's reforms subdivided provinces. By the time of Constantine, Palestine was grouped into Palestina Prima, with Caesarea as metropolis and Aelia within it, Palestina Secunda, Galilee, Golan, and Palestina Tertia, the Negev and southern Transjordan. Aelia remained a colony with a legionary footprint and municipal government. Caesarea kept the governor's seat and the main civil court. After 313, Imperial favor reoriented the ridge again. Constantine's toleration of Christianity, Edict of Milan, and patronage of church building made Jerusalem a goal rather than a backwater. Between 326 and 328, his mother Helena conducted a celebrated pilgrimage. Imperial building campaigns followed. The complex that became the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, encompassing a rock-cut tomb and the site venerated as Golgotha, was completed and dedicated by 335. The project removed part of Hadrian's temple to Venus and reshaped the Western Hills urban fabric to create atria, basilica, and rotunda. Pilgrimage infrastructure grew around it. Hospices, markets, and a new east-west street alignment to carry traffic to the complex. Texts from the period record the change in tone. The Bordeaux Pilgrim's Itinerarium, 333 CE, is the earliest known Christian guide to the city, listing distances from station to station, from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to Mount Zion, Siloam, Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. Eusebius of Caesarea compiled his Onomasticon, an index of biblical places keyed to the new pilgrim geography across Palestine. Imperial law in the late 4th century under Theodosius banned public pagan sacrifices. In Aelia, civic space became increasingly Christian in use, while the legionary presence continued at the edges. Jewish access to the ridge remained restricted but not wholly absent. Late antique sources differ on scope, but a pattern emerges. Local Jewish communities around the city endured, while the colony's core held Christian civic institutions. The 9th of Av fast consolidated memories of both destructions, 586 BCE and 70 CE, adding later calamities into a single liturgy. Kino, Lamentations, grew around the date. The fast and the direction of prayer kept the hill's absence present in daily practice far from the site. One brief imperial interlude almost changed the mount. In 361, Julian, the last pagan emperor, reversed some of Constantine's policies. Ammianus Marcellinus, a contemporary historian friendly to Julian, reports that the emperor authorized and funded an attempt to rebuild the Jewish temple in 362/363. Work crews gathered, cleared foundations, and prepared materials. An earthquake struck the region in May 363, and Ammianus says flames burst from near the foundations and drove workers back. Julian's death in the Persian campaign soon after ended the project. His Christian successors did not continue it. The episode survives in multiple sources with different emphases, but the outcome is constant. No rebuilt sanctuary followed, and the mount remained without a temple. By the later 4th and 5th centuries, Aelia, now commonly called Jerusalem, again in Christian texts, was a Christian pilgrimage city with a Roman grid, a bishop, and congregations tied to the wider church. Monasticism took root in the Judean desert. Lauras and monasteries appeared at places like Mar Saba above the Kidron. Councils and bishops took part in doctrinal disputes recorded by church historians. The city's festivals drew crowds. The Cardo's colonnades carried pilgrims between churches. Inscriptions in Greek and Latin marked civic dedications. Shops catered to traffic from Egypt, Syria, and beyond. The countryside remained complicated. Samaritan communities to the north, centered on Mount Gerizim, experienced major uprisings in the 5th and 6th centuries. Imperial responses were severe, with punitive measures and church construction at contested sacred sites. In Judea and Galilee, Jewish villages continued to build synagogues and to inscribe donor lists. Amulets and oil lamps from the period tie local crafts to wider markets. The legal center of Jewish life stayed in the north. Traditions remember the Patriarchate, Nasi, ending by the early 5th century under Theodosius II, with imperial removal of its fiscal privileges. The Yerushalmi's redaction closed by then. The Babylonian Talmud, completed later in Sasanian Mesopotamia, would become the dominant corpus in subsequent centuries. But the Galilean strand remained rooted in this landscape. Archaeological layers in the city reflect these transitions. Under today's Damascus Gate lie remains of Aelia's North Gate. To the east, segments of the Hadrianic/late Roman wall line can be traced. The main Cardo's column bases and shop fronts are visible in the old city's souks. A secondary Cardo was added in late antiquity to link civic nodes. Within the Holy Sepulchre complex, phases of Constantinian and later work are detectable in masonry and foundation cuts. On the mount's southwestern corner, the Herodian ashlars toppled in 70 still rest over the street's flagstones. They became, in late antiquity, a visible memorial in stone, even as the colony functioned around them. Administration was stable, but not quiet. Earthquakes, notably in 363, and again in 419 and 447, damaged churches and urban fabric. Repairs layered new masonry over old. Law codes from Theodosius and Justinian record regulations about synagogues and conversions alongside standard municipal matters. Tax registers and papyri from the broader region show rents, water rights, and crop shares negotiated in a mixed economy of Christians, Jews, and Samaritans under imperial courts. Through it all, memory circulated outward. In Rome, the Arch of Titus continued to display the menorah carried from the sanctuary. Copies of its panel appear in late antique and medieval media. Diaspora synagogues incorporated prayers that named the ridge. Christian liturgy fixed stations in the city to feast days. The story of the fall and its aftermath spread into texts taught in schools, Josephus's Greek histories, reused by Christian authors, Tacitus's summary in Latin, rabbinic tractates that legislated mourning and hope. By the end of the 5th century, the city's identity was set for the next turn of history. A Christian metropolis with a Roman street plan and Byzantine churches, a garrison in or near its precincts, and layers of older stones visible at the margins. Jewish communities organized in the north with law and learning anchored in Tiberias and Sepphoris, Samaritan communities in the Central Highlands with their own institutions, and imperial administration, listing the region in its ledgers as Palestina Prima and its neighbors. The ridge had exchanged meanings several times since 70 CE, but traces of each phase remained. Herodian Ashlar, Hadrianic Gate, Constantinian Rotunda, stacked within walking distance. The next movements belong to the 6th to 7th centuries. New churches under Justinian and his successors, Samaritan revolts and reprisals, and then the Persian-Byzantine War that would breach the walls from the east, followed by the early Islamic conquest that rewrote the city's topography yet again. The fall of 70 set a template: siege, fire, repurposing, memory, that later centuries would reuse in different keys. In late antiquity, that template hardened into law, liturgy, and streets, waiting for the next army to test it. The 6th century opened with a city recast as a Roman colony and administered through a Christian lens, yet still carrying the older stones like undertext. Imperial policy and local devotion pulled Jerusalem, Aelia Capitolina in the ledgers, into a new network of churches, pilgrims, and roads. Justinian's long reign, 527 to 565, set the physical tone. He commissioned a monumental basilica on the city's southeastern ridge, the Nea Church, New Church of the Theotokos, dedicated in 543, cutting terraces into bedrock and tying the precinct to the main cardo by extending that colonnaded street south. Mosaic mapmakers in far-off Madaba recorded the result in Tesserae. Jerusalem with twin cardines, the Holy Sepulchre's rotunda at the west, the Nea dominating the east, gates labeled, porticos neat and regular. Building generated its own infrastructure. Hostels and xenodochia for the sick and poor. Cisterns and conduits renewed. Monastic houses multiplied on the urban edges and along the desert roads. Beneath the imperial facade, older tensions resurfaced. Samaritan uprisings broke out in the Central Highlands, first under Zeno, 484, later under Justinian, 529, and again in the 500s, centered on Neapolis, Shechem, and Mount Gerizim. Byzantine responses were punitive and architectural, executions and deportations, churches planted at contested shrines, garrisons tightened along the hill spine. Earthquakes punctuated the century. The Great Shock of 551 in the Levant, others noted in 559 and the early 560s, cracking porticos and bringing repairs that layered new masonry over old. By the opening of the 7th century, a larger war reached the city. In 602, a coup in Constantinople killed Emperor Maurice. His successor focuses weakness, invited Sasanian Persia to press west. Khosrow II's armies rolled through Mesopotamia and Syria. By 614, the general Shahrbaraz stood before Jerusalem with Persian troops and allied contingents. The siege lasted weeks, not months. Sources give 20 days more often than not. The walls failed on the north. The city fell with heavy casualties. The patriarch Zacharias was taken. Sacred relics, including the true cross, were removed eastward. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre burned. Other churches suffered damage. Jewish communities, barred from the colony since Hadrian, aided the Persians and were briefly allowed back into the city under the new administration. Within a few years, Persian policy shifted again with the war's tides. Accounts of killings at the Mamilla Pool and elsewhere survive in Christian chronicles. Their numbers swing widely and cannot be verified, but they preserve the memory of a sharp, localized catastrophe amid a regional campaign. The map did not hold long. In 622, Heraclius began a counteroffensive from Constantinople, striking across Anatolia and into the Persian heartland. His victory at Nineveh in December 627 unseated Khosrow's regime. Persian commanders sought terms. In 628 to 629, the true cross returned to Jerusalem in ceremony. Heraclius himself entered the city to acclaim and prayers. Tradition remembers a promise of protection to Jews who had resettled and a subsequent reversal under pressure from clerics. The sources disagree, but the direction is clear. The Byzantine administration reasserted itself, and Jewish access was again restricted. Reconstruction began. Basilicas repaired, clergy reinstalled, the civic grid patched. For a moment, the Constantinian map seemed restorable. A different frontier overtook it. In 636, Rashidun armies broke the Byzantine field force at the Yarmouk. Syria-Palestine lay open. Within 2 years, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah advanced on Jerusalem, with Khalid ibn al-Walid among his commanders. The city's walls had seen too many sieges to invite another sack. Patriarch Sophronius negotiated. Traditional accounts preserve his insistence on surrendering to the caliph in person. Umar arrived from Arabia. Sources differ whether the year was 637 or 638, and received the capitulation. The terms, remembered in later recensions as the Covenant, U'ohda, guaranteed Christian lives, churches, and property in exchange for tax and political submission. Jews, long excluded, were permitted to resettle in controlled numbers. The caliph is said to have declined to pray inside the Anastasis, Holy Sepulchre, so that his act would not be used to appropriate the church. Instead, he prayed nearby and issued an explicit protection. The city's administrative name shifted in usage from Aelia to Elia, and, increasingly, Bait al-Maqdis / Al-Quds. Its legal grammar changed to Islamic rule. That change was architectural as much as juridical. The vast ashlar platform the Romans had left empty since 70, known to Christians as the Temple Mount and to Muslims as Al-Haram al-Sharif, was cleared of refuse and rough stones. An early wooden oratory rose on its southern side for the Friday prayer. Under the Umayyads, the sanctuary took permanent form. Caliph Abd al-Malik commissioned the Dome of the Rock, Qubat al-Sakhra, completed in 691/692, an octagon girdling the exposed bedrock, topped by a timber dome, wrapped in mosaics that joined vegetal scrolls with inscriptions proclaiming God's oneness and the prophetic mission of Muhammad. His son, Al-Walid, built a congregational mosque on the southern edge, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, finished by the early 8th century and paired with administrative palaces to the south of the platform. Together, they set a new sacred axis without erasing the old. Christian pilgrimage continued to the Holy Sepulchre. The Cardo still carried traders beneath its colonnades. Monasteries in the Judean desert kept their vigils above the Kidron. The early Islamic city ran within a provincial framework. Jerusalem, Ilya, Beit al-Maqdis, sat in Jun Philistin, with the administrative capital at Lydda, and later at Ramla. Greek and Syriac speakers shared streets with Arabic. Tax registers tracked the Kharaj and Jizya alongside market tolls. Courts recorded contracts in Arabic and Greek scripts. Archaeology traces this phase in floors and foundations. The Umayyad palatial complex, south of the Haram, with its bathhouses and audience halls, reused column drums along the Cardo, glass weights stamped with governors' names, milestones and seals that fix a bureaucracy to the road. Memory layered new stories over old stones. Christian chroniclers like Sophronius left homilies of plague and pilgrimage. The Piacenza pilgrim, circa 570, had earlier mapped routes that continued under new rulers with altered tariffs. Muslim tradition recorded Umar's visit, the clearing of the platform, and the city's virtues. Later, geographers folded Jerusalem into compendia of sacred topography. Jewish travelers found ways to approach again. Over time, a small but visible community reappeared near the markets and on the city's northwestern slopes, edging back after centuries of bans and brief returns. Across the 7th century, the ridge absorbed 3 sovereigns' visions without losing its own contours. Justinian's basilica had set one east-west balance. The Persian sack and Byzantine return had burned and rebuilt the Constantinian web. The Rashidun and Umayyad projects set a new focus on the long empty esplanade, while preserving Christian sites and reopening a Jewish foothold. Each phase left dates that can be walked. A dedicatory inscription fragment of the Nea on a reused ashlar. A fire layer tied to 614 under the Holy Sepulchre. Umayyad mosaic and stucco south of the Haram. The Madaba maps tesserae, matching the Cardo still visible under the old city market. Administration kept pace with the stones. Under the late Umayyads and early Abbasids, officials rotated. Coinage shifted legends. Repairs followed earthquakes, notably the 746 to 749 shocks. that damaged churches and mosques across the Jordan Valley and the highlands. The city's name, Aelia in Latin Acts, Elia, and later Al-Quds in Arabic, Hierosolima in Greek, coexisted across documents. Processions adjusted routes. Legal opinions weighed shared walls and holy days with practical detail. The ridge's identity became tri-layered. Christian festival city with a bishop and monasteries. Islamic sanctuary city with 2 great mosques and a governor. Jewish memory city with prayers pointed toward it and a modest, persistent return. What began in 70 as a template, siege, fire, repurposing, inscription into law, had by the end of the 7th century become a rhythm the city could not choose but learned to survive. The old ashlars still lay heaped at the southwestern corner of the platform, where they fell under Titus. Above them rose new arcades and mihrabs. Westward, the rotunda of the Anastasis carried lamps under a repaired dome. From the ridge, roads now ran not just to Caesarea and Damascus, but to the caliphal capitals, Damascus, then Baghdad, tying Jerusalem to a different center without cutting its older cords. The next turn would add further layers. Abbasid administration and repairs, Byzantine attempts to contest the frontier, and, centuries later, Latin armies whose banners would reimpose siege and fire on a city that had learned too well how to receive both. The Abbasid dawn brought a different rhythm to the ridge. With the Caliphate's center shifted to Baghdad after 750, Jerusalem's status was less administrative than devotional, yet its stones kept their leverage. Governors rotated through Ramlah, the provincial seat of Yund Philistin, while Jerusalem held courts of law, markets, hospices, and the paired sanctuaries on the eastern platform. Repairs followed the mid-8th century earthquakes that had cracked colonnades across the Jordan Rift. Abbasid patrons renewed roofs and pavements at Al-Aqsa and along the Great Esplanade. Workshops on the western hill reset lintels and reopened shops fronting the Cardo. Harun al-Rashid's era left traces in charters and gifts. Western pilgrims, aided by Frankish royal patronage, found hospices near the Holy Sepulchre. Gifts and lights funded to burn through feast nights gave the rotunda a steady glow. Communities multiplied in the lanes. The local church, now part of a network that ran from Caesarea to Constantinople, kept a calendar of processions and restored shrines that earlier fires had dimmed. The Jewish presence, thin since the Hadrianic colony, grew again in the 9th and 10th centuries, anchored by courts and academies that later letters call the Palestinian Gaonate. The Karaite movement found a strong foothold in the city, debating script and calendar within walking distance of the markets. Missives preserved in the Cairo Geniza show merchants and scholars sending grain, candles, and legal questions up to Jerusalem, and returning with rulings and receipts. Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew inscriptions shared walls. Coins changed legends without changing hands too quickly. The political horizon flickered. In 878, Ahmad ibn Tulun peeled Egypt and Syria from the Abbasids. His officials taxed the coastal plain and paid the ridge less attention than the ports. After 905, the Abbasids returned. In 935, the Ikhshidids of Egypt held the province. In 969, the Fatimids, Ismaili caliphs from North Africa, took Egypt and then advanced into Palestine. Between dynasties, the city's daily grammar, tax registers, market tolls, repairs after winter storms, continued under new seals. Raids punctuated that continuity. Carmatians harried the plains in the 10th century, seizing Ramla more than once and sending fear up the hill. Imperial borders shifted north and east, bringing Byzantine armies as far as the Jordan under John Tzimiskis in 975 before they withdrew, leaving gifts and promises rather than governors. Fire returned by order, where accident had often sufficed. In 1009, the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah commanded the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other churches in the city and beyond. The demolition shocked Christian polities from Constantinople to the Latin West. Letters and homilies carried the news through monasteries and courts. Later Fatimids reversed course. By the 1020s, treaties with Byzantium and local petitions allowed rebuilding. By 1042 to 1048, the Holy Sepulchre stood again, not in its Constantinian footprint, but reconfigured. An abbreviated complex centered on the rotunda, and a new western atrium. The nave Constantine had raised was gone. The shrine's profile narrowed and hardened, ready to be embellished again by later patrons. Pilgrims kept moving. Accounts from the 11th century describe German, Italian, and Frankish groups, threading Anatolia and Syria to reach the Holy City. Some welcomed with gifts and escorts, others robbed on mountain roads. The Seljuk ascendancy, after Manzikert, 1071, pulled the ground from under those roots. Turkoman commanders pushed into Syria. Atsuz ibn Uwak seized Jerusalem in 1073, ruling with tight rations and hard discipline. Famine struck in 1077 to 1078. Chroniclers speak of dearth so severe that the living envied the buried. The Fatimid vizier Al-Afdal Shahanshah exploited the churn and retook the city in 1098, a year before an army no one in Jerusalem had seen before crested the western approaches under the sign of the cross. Between rulers, the fabric of the place persisted. The 11th century Cardo still shouldered vendors' awnings. The Hospitallers' precursors, the canons of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Latin Hospice of St. Mary, managed beds and bread as best they could. Jewish courts wrote deeds and decided inheritances. Muslim judges posted opinions on shop doors alongside tax notices. The 1033 earthquake, then others nearer the century's end, cracked vaults and toppled sections of the eastern colonnades. Masons learned yet again how to take down and reset the same stones. Fatimid inscriptions recorded restorations on the Haram. Timber shipments arrived from the coast for repairs to roofs that wind and sun had worn thin. The city's sanctuaries continued to define the skyline and the calendar. On the platform, the Umayyad work still set the axis. The dome of the rock's octagon in patterned mosaic and gilded skin. The long prayer hall of Al-Aqsa, repaired and re-roofed after earthquakes and fires. Westward, the rebuilt Holy Sepulchre bound Christian time. Lent, Easter, the invention and exaltation of the cross, to processions through sockets and courtyards altered by demolition and reconstruction. Within earshot of both, synagogues held fast days, Tisha B'Av echoing older losses and adding new ones, while academies traded letters with Fustat and the Maghreb about law and calendar. The ridge carried parallel devotions that sometimes crossed, sometimes tolerated, sometimes collided. When the Seljuks' loose net tightened across Syria-Palestine, the road from the north grew unreliable. Byzantine escorts no longer guaranteed a pilgrim's passage through Anatolia. Taxes multiplied at crossings. Raiding bands made detours expensive in coin and blood. Western sermons took those road conditions and braided them with the memory of 1009 into a story of rescue. In 1095, Urban II preached at Clermont. Envoys from the embattled Byzantine court and letters from Levantine churches provided prompts. The rhetoric of aid and remission of sins provided the hinge. The news of a forthcoming expedition reached the coast and the caliphal court in Cairo, in slow, contradictory strands. Jerusalem's last pre-Crusade year belongs to the Fatimid garrison. Al-Afdal had reconquered the city in late 1098 and fortified it in haste. Walls repaired, gates tightened, stores collected from the hills and plains. The guard was a patchwork: Sudanese regiments, Arab and Berber auxiliaries, and local levies set to watchtowers. The governor weighed reports from Ramla and Arsuf, large Frankish contingents in the north, smaller raiding parties near the coast, Genoese and other fleets sounding harbors, treaties offered and broken within months. No one on the ridge could be certain whether the newcomers would turn inland or hold the ports. Archaeology and texts together outline these decades. In the city, Fatimid inscription panels document restorations at Al-Aqsa after the 11th century quakes. Spolia columns along the Cardo carry later capitals but earlier shafts. The rebuilt Holy Sepulchre's plan can be traced in surviving masonry under Crusader and later layers. In the Geniza, legal deeds and letters from the 11th century speak of rents in the Jewish quarter, disputes over shop fronts in the bazaar, and directives to ship oil for lamps at the Western churches. Pilgrim narratives, Latin, Greek, Armenian, list way stations, tolls, and the prices of bread and water. The ground and the paper agree on the essentials. A city still functioning, often bruised, sometimes protected, rarely left alone. The last approach to 1099 was a matter of steps measured in dust. The Fatimid governor watched summer heat build. The cisterns, filled in spring, would have to last through siege, if siege came. Messengers brought word that the Franks had taken Antioch, then fallen to infighting, then rallied, that Edessa had become a new lordship, that streets in the north named the Holy City without knowing its alleys. Scouts climbed the western ridges and looked down at fields that fed the markets, barley and figs silvered by the wind, calculating what would be trampled and what could be burned to deny it to an enemy. Within the walls, life folded into a brace position. Markets tightened hours. Bakers took grain by measure rather than pile. Wells were checked. The sick were moved closer to hospices. Clergy in both shrines, east and west, reviewed their treasuries and narrowed their uses. Jewish households that had found a foothold in the northwest quarter weighed kin and coin. Some left with caravans. Others remained as communities had remained through every prior change of banners. The city counted its strengths and weaknesses with an accountant's calm. 90-day store here, a fault in this gate hinge there, stone ready to roll from this parapet, a broken water conduit on the southern slope no one had yet found time to mend. The horizon answered. In early June 1099, dust on the coastal roads thickened, and banners with unfamiliar animals and crosses appeared on the hills beyond Ramla. The Fatimid field army was not yet in sight. The newcomers had outrun their own ships, and summer had outrun them in turn. They brought engines in pieces, only some of which would survive the march. They brought vows and letters from princes who would claim their victories after the fact. They brought hunger. What they found was a walled city accustomed to being the object of vows. At this point, the city's long pattern, siege, fire, repurposing, was poised to repeat in a new key. The walls stood patched and serviceable. The platform to the east held its mosques and courtyards. The rotunda to the west still gathered lamps at dusk. The Cardo shouldered awnings. The Herodian towers, repaired in this or that century, watched in the same directions they had always watched. The story's next page was already being sharpened in camps outside Ascalon and on ships tacking for Jaffa. Inside the walls, people who had learned to live under repeated regimes did the practical work they always did before an army came into view. They filled jars, moved children, counted doors, and waited for the first stone to arc out of a machine whose crews could not yet see the city's shadow. Heat held the plain when the banners appeared on the western ridges. In early June 1099, the Frankish host reached Jerusalem after a hard march from the coast, short of water and engines, long on vows. The Fatimid governor had repaired gates and parapets, filled cisterns, and pulled stores up from the fields. The walls, patched across centuries, stood serviceable. Northern stretches between the Damascus and Herod's gates. Western runs above the Tyropoeon, the southern line along Mount Zion. Within, the mosques and courtyards of the Haram al-Sharif anchored the eastern skyline. The rotunda of the Anastasis, Holy Sepulchre, held the west. Markets tightened their hours. Wells were checked. Watch posts counted arrows and stones. The first contact tested both sides' stamina more than their stone. The Crusaders' opening assault on 13th June failed under heat, fatigue, and a shortage of ladders. Water ran scarce in the siege lines. The springs at Siloam and the pool of Mamilla were contested. The sun made every move costlier than the plan required. Foragers brought in timber from the hills to the north and west. Mules dragged beams salvaged from anywhere they could find them. Houses abandoned to the line, orchards stripped to stumps. A Genoese contingent, landing at Jaffa in mid-June, broke ships for nails, cordage, and planks. Their carpenters joined Norman and Lotharingian crews to frame towers and rams. The city replied with night sorties from the gates, burning work parties when the wind turned favorable, and slipping back before cavalry could close. By early July, the investment tightened. Raymond of Saint-Gilles held the south near Mount Sion. Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, and Tancred faced the northern walls. Siege towers rose in sections, sheathed in hides against fire. Rams swung under leather screens where the ground allowed them to reach gates. Inside, defenders braced with beams, hurled jars of naphtha and stones, and rolled burning brushwood when a tower crept too near. On the 10th to 13th of July, a fast, urged by the clergy in the Frankish camp, reset morale. On the night of the 13th, Godfrey's men quietly moved their largest tower eastward along the north wall to a section judged weaker, while Raymond shifted his own machine to press the southern line. On 14th to 15th July, the siege became decision. The northern tower closed with the wall. Its drawbridge slammed onto the battlements. A handful of men crossed and fought to hold a notch long enough for more to follow. Near midday on the 15th, the northern defense buckled. Gates opened from within. Files in mail spilled along the parapets and into the lanes. On the south, Raymond's pressure at Zion compounded the collapse. By afternoon, the city lay in Crusader hands. Contemporary Latin, Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and Hebrew sources agree on the broad outline that followed and differ in detail and emphasis. There was wide killing in the wake of entry, combatants cut down in fighting, and many inhabitants slain. Sanctuaries were breached. Plunder followed capture. Some groups found protection under particular leaders and standards, while others did not. Tancred claimed to have set guards at Al-Aqsa for those who yielded under his banner. Elsewhere, the discipline of victory broke. The accounts are not uniform, and the numbers conflict, but the shape is constant. A sack remembered as severe across every tradition that recorded it. The army then turned to ritual. Bareheaded and with a cohort of clergy, leaders went to the Holy Sepulchre and gave thanks. Within days, the host elected a ruler for the city they had vowed to reach. Raymond refused a crown. Godfrey of Bouillon accepted power with the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Avoiding the word king inside the city of the Passion. A Latin patriarch, Arnulf of Chaux, was chosen and installed. Administration had to materialize in rooms that still smelled of smoke, guards posted to gates, Markets reopened with fixed prices, weights and measures standardized, a levy organized to repair breaches. Strategically, the new regime had no time to rest. Al-Afdal Shahanshah, the Fatimid vizier, marched north from Egypt with a field army to reverse the loss. The Crusader leaders left a garrison and moved south in July-August, meeting the Fatimids near Ascalon on 12th August, 1099. The battle was short and decisive. A dawn advance, a hard push through camp lines, and a rout when the Fatimid formation broke. Ascalon itself did not fall. It would remain a Fatimid fortress until 1153. But the immediate threat to Jerusalem lifted. The road between the ridge and the coast, though still dangerous, was workable enough for ships to feed a capital. Jerusalem's sacred topography was recast to fit Latin rule. The dome of the rock, Qubat al-Sacra, became the Templum Domini, Temple of the Lord, crowned with a metal cross and served by cannons. Al-Aqsa was designated the Templum Salomonis, Temple of Solomon, and used as a palace and administrative seat by the new rulers. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rebuilt by the Byzantines earlier in the century, was repaired and gradually expanded by the Latin canons. Its chapter emerged as the city's most influential ecclesiastical corporation. Streets around both precincts were reorganized to carry processions and markets. Latin liturgy set the rhythm of feast days. Hospice work near the sepulchre grew into a permanent institution, the Hospital of St. John, which would receive a papal charter in 1113 and evolve into the Order of the Hospitallers. Population policy followed the sword. Many Muslims were expelled in the first months. Others returned under truce for work and trade, settled in suburbs beyond the walls or under protection of particular lords. The Jewish community, small but present under Islamic rule, was initially barred. A few documentary traces suggest gradual, limited returns under guarantees as the Latin state normalized. Eastern Christian communities, Greek, Armenian, Syriac, remained and negotiated rights within the Latin hierarchy, keeping their own liturgies at long-standing shrines. Governance had to be invented as a daily craft. Godfrey died in July 1100, after a year marked by constant campaigning. His brother Baldwin, Lord of Edessa, took the throne as Baldwin I and chose a king's title openly, crowned at Bethlehem on Christmas Day 1100. Under Baldwin I and his successor Baldwin II, 1118 to 1131, the kingdom's institutions settled. Feudal tenures for Western settlers. A haute cour where barons sat in judgment. Viscounts and castellans in the city. Latin patriarchs managing a patchwork of church properties across the realm. Fortifications multiplied. Towers along the city wall reset or newly raised. Citadels along the routes to Jaffa, Ramla, and Hebron. Castles at the kingdom's edges. Montreal, Shobak, and Kerak guarding the king's highway to the east. The harem and the western hill each bore visible marks of the new order. On the platform, the Templum Domini acquired cloisters and an altar. The Templum Salomonis housed the ruler's hall, and, later, the community of warrior monks that took its name from that building. The Temple, Templars, formally recognized in 1129 after gathering in the city in the 1120s. Westward, the sepulchre's canons added chapels and galleries. Pilgrim traffic from Europe surged, bringing gifts that funded stone and lamps. Street by street, the Latin market quarter took form. Butchers and spice sellers near the sepulchre. Metal workers closer to the old Tyropoion. Hostels lining the approaches to both shrines. Notarial acts in Latin, Greek, and Arabic recorded rents on shops and houses. Seals of the kings and patriarchs fixed obligations. Coinage struck in the city mixed Western forms with familiar weights. None of this removed Jerusalem from contest. The Fatimids raided from Ascalon for decades. Truce and skirmish alternated along the coastal plain. To the northeast, new powers took shape. Mosul's Atabegs, Aleppo's Emirs, and, by mid-century, Zengi and the Nur al-Din in Damascus, whose programs would one day converge on the Latin states. But in the first decades after 1099, the ridge was held by men who learned quickly how to turn siege lines into law and processions into chartered rites. Archaeology has fixed parts of this phase to the ground. Crusader masonry lines the outer walls, large drafted stones keyed to earlier foundations. The citadel at the Jaffa Gate shows phases of Latin repair over Roman and early Islamic cores. Pavements and capitals along the market streets carry Romanesque profiles. Reused inscribed stones in thresholds preserve older scripts under later feet. On the Haram, medieval crosses once cut into the dome's marble revetment have been recorded and in some cases removed in restorations. Vaults beneath the platform show workrooms and cisterns, the Latin administration adapted for storage. In the Holy Sepulchre, chapels added in the 12th century rest on foundations laid after the 1009 demolition and 11th century Byzantine rebuild. Latin inscriptions still mark corners behind later plaster. From the perspective of the longer arc traced in this documentary, the events of 1099 to 1100 fit a pattern that began in 70. Siege under summer sun. Entry, a period of killing and dispossession. An accelerated repurposing of sacred spaces. A new administrative vocabulary stamped into stone and coin. A memory regime to justify and explain. The names changed. Vespasian and Titus. Shaharbaraz and Heraclius. Umar and Abd al-Malik. Godfrey and Baldwin. But the ridge received each language and obliged each to learn its contours. In the years that followed, the city would see further remakings, the consolidation of the Latin kingdom, the rise of military orders headquartered at the Haram and near the Sepulchre. Then, the counter-movement under Nur al-Din and Salah al-Din that would bring another siege and another transfer of keys in 1187. Later, Ayyubid and Mamluk programs of repair, Ottoman walls redrawn on older lines. Those episodes lie beyond the present chronicle. This account set out to follow one chain, the Siege of 70 and its aftermath through late antiquity, the early Islamic transformation, and the crucible of 1099, the ways a city of stone absorbed fire, law, and prayer, and kept a shape recognizable across regimes. Walk the ridge and the layers announce themselves. Herodian ashlar at the southwest corner of the platform lies toppled where it fell under Titus. Hadrian's grid runs under later streets. Constantinian and Justinian churches left foundations that guide modern footsteps. Umayyad mosaics and stucco still pattern light south of the Haram. Latin arches and door jambs hold thresholds in the markets. Each piece belongs to a ledger of sieges and settlements that began long before 1099 and did not end there. The fall of Jerusalem, Roman, Persian, Arab, Latin, was never only a moment. It was a method by which empires wrote themselves into stone, and communities learned how to remember under new roofs. Here, the narrative closes where it must, with the city held again by a new power, its shrines renamed and rekeyed, its markets reopened under fresh ordinances, its streets carrying processions in a different tongue. The plain beyond the walls returns to barley and fig. The cisterns wait for winter rain. The ridge keeps its habit of outlasting banners.